If I ask you to picture yourself living in a village a couple decades ago, say during the 50s, and to compare that image with the urban lifestyle you hold now, what would come to your mind? I can say that the first thing that came to my mind was, wow, I really don't think I could live without cheap takeout food. And the second thing that came to mind was, aren't we all better off here in the city? I mean, think about it. In theory, city living should have everything going for us. Cultural diversity is at a maximum. Social diversity is at a maximum. And with the rise of technology and social media, connections are becoming as easy to multiply as they are to maintain. These were my very confident sentiments about urbanization. That is, until I heard one of my role models speak a few months ago. Michel Chikwanine is a peace advocate and former child soldier from the country of Congo. Last February, I had the honor of hearing him deliver a keynote address to a Model United Nations conference. His entire address was perspective-altering for me. But what struck me the most was his rather light-hearted introduction to the grave matters at hand. For to his speech about his solemn life experiences, he opened with a story about his community. Michel passionately and with admiration described his family, the people who made him the man he is today. And he continued to paint most distinctly an image of his hometown's marketplace. He brought to life the colored stalls, the children weaving between the legs of their mothers. Of Michel Chikwanine's hometown were united in almost every aspect. Their society was whole, and they formed a community. And it's this sense of community which has nearly a generation. In a village, community could be easily defined as a feeling of fellowship with others, which came as a result of living within the same geographical region. But come to the city, and that may not be the case. You and your neighbor may not be of the same ethnic background or culture, and you may not have anything in common besides a similar home address. Furthermore, you yourself may be an immigrant, thousands of miles away from your extended family and the culture you are so familiar with. And so now, as a result, city dwellers are having to search farther and dig deeper to make those meaningful and intimate social connections. And it's something that many of us no longer have the time to designate to do. And it's having an adverse effect on our society. And it's not urbanization itself that's the core issue here. I mean, ask me to come up and do a talk about rural living or how we should better off live in the countryside, and I'd probably come up here and say, Google it. But no, the issue lies in how our culture has fallen behind in this physical shift from living with a small group of people to a very large one. It's how easy that feeling of belonging was to achieve when you're surrounded by an intimate village community, and how difficult it can be now within an urban sprawl. And it's this focus on individualization that's coming from our media and our society when we need to be focused on community building now more than ever. And so you may ask, why do we need to talk about community? Why is it more important now than it ever was before? The answer lies in 4 obstacles to societal progression which have been on the rise since urbanization began. 1, that urban poverty rates have grown or stagnated. 2, that we are losing connection with our elderly population. 3, that a mental health crisis can be observed in cities globally. And finally, that as a society, we can't seem to pinpoint and attack the root of all these issues. For we throw money at charities, we pay taxes for welfare, there are senior centers, and there are groups dedicated to the advocacy and awareness of mental health. So what have we forgotten? Our urban culture forgot to emphasize the importance of community building. Let me explain. Let's first take a look at the urban poverty crisis, and let's take America, for example. 1996 to over 1.6 million in 2011. That's a growth of over 159%, and that came even after the 1996 welfare reform, which was originally considered a success. In addition to that, when you look at Canada, the situation isn't all that much better. In BC alone, child poverty rates are still at 18.8%, which means that 1 in 5 British Columbian kids are still growing up poor. Most appalling is that this is a stat that hasn't changed in over 2 decades. We see that urbanization, through the weakening of our communities, has allowed for these gaps in social inequality to just augment and increase. We see that urban culture has allowed us to place ourselves within these bubbles, isolated from many of the social issues that pervade us in our very own backyards. And as a result, local social issues have only augmented. But when you go out into your local community, when you search to build those connections with people in your area, everything changes. Outside of school, I've done a lot of fundraising for an organization called Mom to Mom Child Poverty Initiative Vancouver. And I recently had the honor of sitting down with the organization's executive director to talk about the work that they do for families living in poverty in Greater Vancouver. And so Melinda began to talk about the founder of Mom to Mom's story of how the organization came to be. And interestingly, our conversation centered very much upon how community was actually the essential ingredient to lifting families out of the cycle of poverty that traps them. The founder of Mom to Mom went out into local inner city schools and established an outreach program. And she, as a developmental pediatrician, would make recommendations to the families as to how they could change their lifestyle so that their kids would be better prepared for success. And the program exhibited great success on its own. These suggestions, combined with financial aid, saw an increase in the quality of life for many of the families. But once the founder of Mom to Mom left these families, what she saw was that the situation reverted back to what it originally once was. And she soon realized that this was because of the deep isolation that many women in poverty find themselves in. When you're a family surrounded by other families that are living in the exact same impoverished situation as you don't have that diverse social community that's there to help lift you out of the life situation that you might be in. And so as a result, Mom to Mom's mission statement became refocused onto community building. They began to connect mothers who were living in poverty with other female volunteers across the city to establish those genuine community connections and friendships. And this is a program that they have kept up to date, and it's seen an incredible amount of success. And so it's through the work of Mom to Mom which I realized the importance of community when it comes to helping any kind of a population out in a sustainable manner. And so, in addition to this disconnect we're seeing on the rise between members of wealthy versus poor populations, we're also losing connection with a rapidly growing segment of our society, the elderly. Urbanization has led to an increase in the number of nuclear families. And when you combine this with the increasing number of technological barriers between generations, we become a society that's rapidly losing contact with our elderly population. And with it, we lose a perspective on our lives that is so integral to societal progression. And urban culture is no longer stressing the value nor importance of building those community connections with elderly within your life. I myself only used to volunteer at early child care centers or summer camps with younger children. But for the past 2 years, my friends and I have made a point into going out to our local community and volunteering at a senior center called Little Mountain Place. And at first, I thought this experience would greatly sadden me. For the elderly at Little Mountain, many of them were extremely frail, suffer from dementia or Alzheimer's. But after a couple days volunteering at the center, I realized just how valuable it is to have those connections with elderly people in your life. Because it didn't matter whether or not a resident told me her life story the same amount of times or 3 times within the same 20 minutes. It was still an incredible life story. And it was truly heartening to see a few residents get up and dance after a few drinks during their twice-a-month happy hour sessions. And it was even more heartening to see how happy some of these elderly would get when they won a game of bingo or made a craft successfully. And so it's through this volunteer work at Little Mountain Place that I realized the value of taking on that responsibility to take care of the elderly segment of our population. And so now I'd like to come back to a quote that Melinda provided with me upon the finishing of our interview. Oh, that's us. Okay. When we finished our interview, Melinda said that it used to be that you were born into a community and had to fight to become an individual. But now, it seems as if you were born an individual and have to fight to be part of a community. These words could not hold more truth for much of our urban society, as we see this battle to reach belonging hit our generation through the rise of mental illness. Urbanization has been linked to increased rates of depression and anxiety through a multitudinous array of studies. In addition, it's become well known that the mental health of Canadian youth specifically is a serious and underserved health issue. At any given time, 15% of our youth are suffering from some kind of mental disorder, with 70% of all psychiatric disorders emerging during the years of adolescence. One of the most shocking statistics that I found upon research was that in 2012, it was measured that 1 in 12 youth aged 15 to 24 in the provinces of BC, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba were administered some form of antipsychotic medication. And these rates were found to be especially high in urban centers. And so when we see the loneliness that urbanization can create get compounded with this new dependence on social media and technology for validation, it's the recipe for mental chaos. And the primary method that we as a society need to start taking towards combating this issue is building those stronger communities. Because knowing that you really belong to a population is some of the most strong form of mental support that anybody can have. And when the number of citizens living in urban areas is going to double come 2050, we're going to need this support system more than ever before. And I dare say that building community and positive change is as simple as saying hello, taking the time to get to know your neighbor, to visit your local senior center, and just take a look for a day, offer to volunteer, getting to know local poverty crises, and getting to know a local nonprofit organization. For as much as we're starting to experience and realize the adverse effects that urbanization can have upon our society, we're failing to realize the core of our humanities issues, which is that communities are falling apart.